Thank you everyone so much for joining so far. We're hoping to have a couple more people tune in throughout the session, but on behalf of ImpactSTL, welcome to our first panel of the academic year on voter suppression and misinformation in St. Louis. We are joined with three amazing panelists who have so kindly dedicated the next hour and a half to sharing their insight and advice and guidance ahead of our election and ahead of our registration deadline in Missouri tomorrow. So I'm excited to introduce all of them. And something fun for our webinar to encourage you all to engage with our panelists directly is that each panelist will pose an open-ended question at the beginning of our session for you all to consider and chat in the chat box about and share your ideas that we will then circle back to at the end of our discussion and hopefully leave with a couple of action items for us all to get involved with ahead of November 3rd, which is a quick 28 days away today. So very exciting. And without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our panelists. So first, we have Jennifer Lohman. Jennifer is the co-founder and director of the St. Louis Area Voter Protection Coalition and participates on the Elections Committee for the League of Women Voters of Metro St. Louis. Jennifer helped organize the metro area's largest ever election protection field program in 2018 as a volunteer for the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition and is currently coordinator of the 2020 election protection efforts locally. Welcome, Jennifer. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And next we have Justin Idleburg. Justin is a racial equity strategist who works with governmental leaders and grassroots nonprofit organizations. He contributes guidance in health equity, educational equity, workforce development, and equitable community development to create an understanding of what a racial equity lens applied looks like on the journey to dismantling disparity rates. Justin also coaches nonprofit agencies to increase their capacity in policy analysis, coalition building, strategic partnerships, legislative advocacy, and organizational development. We're so excited to have Justin here today. Thank you for joining us. And finally, we have Henry Weber, Vice Chancellor Weber to many of us. Vice Chancellor Weber has been Executive Vice Chancellor for Civic and Chief Administrative Officer since 2008 and a Professor of Practice at the George Warren Brown School of Social Work and the School of Architecture and Urban Design at Washington University in St. Louis. In August, he was named WashU's first Executive Vice Chancellor for Civic Affairs and Strategic Planning. In this role, Weber is charged, among other duties, with leading the St. Louis Compact, WashU's commitment to not only be in St. Louis, but for St. Louis as well. In addition to his roles at the university, he is chair of the board of directors of ImpactSTL, the St. Louis region's community development effort, the Washington University Medical Center Redevelopment Cooperation. So we are very excited to have our three panelists here today. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you very much.
So we're going to just give a quick background for some of our participants or audience members who are maybe a little less familiar with the work, as you are all seemingly on the front lines of these efforts in St. Louis. I'll pose the first question to Justin specifically, which is sort of historically in your roles previously, what have been the most prevalent instances of voter suppression in St. Louis? There are obviously additional implications in 2020, but historically, where is this issue manifested most prevalently in our community?
Bad paperwork. You have a lot of entities that are internal, external. They all have different agendas and all different alliances. So when it comes to the information that's being pushed out into the communities north of Delmar, if people don't have relationships with their elected officials, they'll go with someone that comes, looks nice, comes with some nice shiny paperwork and say, this is going to help you. And you know, without knowing that, these people end up, and it's mainly elders who are giving these new people their trust, and they're not there with their full benefit. Versus our current elected officials whom have relationships. Like when you come to our polling places, you see that they're like I didn't get the letter that you left on our door. You didn't get the door hanger. But I did get this. Like, they come to the actual polls with stuff in their hands. Like, this is all the stuff that I'm going to vote for. And our elected officials are like, hold on. No, this, and they have to have a whole 20, 30-minute conversation sometimes, all from other entities bringing and infiltrating other bad information. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So can you talk a little bit more about factors such as age, such as race, even accessibility of that paperwork and housing, how those aspects sort of relate to voter suppression as well?
So in a lot of communities north of Delmar, the population is probably at least 40 to 60% people over the age of 65 years old. And they've been in these communities for 40, 50 years. So the relationships they once had when they were thriving, full of life like us all, not saying they're not that now, but they're not as mobile to be able to get information. COVID has made it to where people really can't knock doors. The Democratic Central Committee just did something I think was awesome, by putting little plastic covers and putting information inside of that. But if they were not doing those type of things, our elders, who are our biggest voter population north of Delmar, wouldn't be able to get anything outside of maybe some bad mail that comes in talking about a prop or a resolution or something that they want to see. And also people not having access to the internet, not being able to have even on their phone, and a lot of elders don't have that. They don't have that technology to connect with the rest of the world, as a lot of us are able to do such. So that's also a hindrance on them not being able to get all the information. As you all may know, a lot of elders like to read newspapers and things in their hands, and they're not able to do that. And COVID, once again, has stopped the door-to-door type of canvassing. I love that, Hank. Thank you. But COVID has stopped a lot of that. And it's created ways, it's made us all go and think of doing things in an unconventional way to reach out to the neighbors or the voters.
Absolutely. And off of that, is there an open-ended question you can pose to our audience to consider throughout the discussion?
My question for you all is, what does a 21st century voting platform look like for you all that's accountable and transparent? Because it would be you all and eligible high school students of age who will be leading us into this next generation. So how can you all create that? And if so, what does that look like? What things do you all want to see? Do you want to have a chat box that connects straightly to your elected officials? Alerts, but those are just some ideas, but that's just something for you all to chew on.
Absolutely. I think that would be great if anyone has ideas to put those in the chat, and I'll ask David, our moderator, to put Justin's question in the chat to be referred back to. I'd love to transition to Jennifer a little bit, going off of Justin's question. So much is different about this 2020 election, and considering you've worked on efforts in voter protection for 2018 and 2020, what is unique about 2020, particularly this coming election, that provides either new instances of suppression that we haven't seen before, or just poses additional barriers for individuals trying to vote?
Well, it definitely does. Missouri in general has among the most restrictive voting laws in the nation, even in the best of times. And with COVID, rather than taking some very simple steps to make voting accessible and safe, our state government, chose to make things more complicated, and in a way that really disenfranchises communities that aren't super dialed in. I mean, and when I say super dialed in, I mean like super, super dialed in, because the situation that we have now is so complicated that, it's rare to find someone who is not confused about how this all works. And if someone, as Justin referred to, doesn't have access to the internet, it's just that much harder to sort through what your options are and how you can vote. And nothing is more emblematic of that than voting by mail and how that works. There are a couple different ways to vote by mail. You can vote absentee by mail, or you can vote a no excuse absentee ballot, or rather a no excuse mail-in ballot. two totally different things, different rules, you know, and it's just, it also requires, you know, to get those ballots, generally internet access to get to the application form. So you're looking at all these steps just to be able to, you know, vote in a way that, you know, doesn't require you to go out in public and potentially expose yourself to COVID. And yet, you know, there hasn't really been a lot of movement toward making that more accessible for people. For example, sending out ballot applications with an explanation of how the system works to everybody. And if you go on, you know, some websites, you know, some election authority websites, some of them explain it pretty well. Others kind of put the applications out there, but in a bit of a vacuum. So people might see the, you know, the mail-in ballot application and think, oh, well, I want to vote by mail, so I'm going to pick that one. When in fact, they've picked an option that's going to be really difficult for them to, you know, submit and, you know, fulfill and have the ballot count. Because not only is the application process onerous, then you get the ballot in the mail, fill it out. There's an affidavit on every that has to be filled out exactly right, or the ballot can be rejected. Sometimes the ballot rejection rates are as high as 10%. And, you know, people, you know, cast that ballot expecting that it's going to count. Not only does it not count, but the voter never knows that it doesn't count, because Missouri law doesn't require the election authority to notify the voter when the ballot is not being counted due to a defect. So, I mean, I could go on all day about, you know, how 2020 is different. And I think just, you know, the growth in the need for mail voting is probably the main thing that has caused a lot of difficulties, but, you know, all the old difficulties still remain too. So it's an absolute firestorm of voter suppression, honestly.
Absolutely. And we're hoping to deep dive into a little of those nuances as well. But is there a question that you would like to pose to our audience today as well?
Yes. You know, for several major election cycles, and I mean, going back, you know, practically to the point when I was a youth voter myself, much has been made of the youth vote, and there have been massive efforts from Rock the Vote to When We All Vote to encourage youth turnout. But youth turnout consistently lags below expectations. And, you know, my question is, why is that? And does disinformation or voter manipulation play a role, especially on social media? Because there are a lot of efforts out there to create dissension and chaos through amplifying, you know, existing disputes. So that is, I guess, my question is, like, is that what's doing it, or is it something else?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that's a great opportunity for us to be reflective, many of whom this is the first time voting in a general election even. So to perhaps reflect on the ways that that process has been either, you know, supportive or not the easiest to go through as well. So thank you. The last sort of introductory question I'll pose is for our Vice Chancellor. I would love to know sort of the efforts around being in St. Louis and for St. Louis. In what ways has the university identified certain goals to mitigate voter suppression within the community, and perhaps for the students on campus as well?
So let me answer that, but let me do a little bit of a preamble to kind of put this issue into its broadest context. I think a lot of us have this view that voting in America is kind of fair. Everybody gets to vote. There's one person, one vote. And that's the way it is. And this misinformation or suppression or any of this is something unusual. While in fact, voting in America has been deeply contested since the beginning of the United States. It has been deeply fought for. I mean, John Lewis, who lives in heaven now, talked about the right for voting to be the most fundamental right. And he was expressing because the people he was represented were essentially disenfranchised. You know, remember, when we started the Constitution, voting was fundamentally limited to white male landowners. And we've had a very gradual, the arc has sort of bended toward justice, but very, very slowly and uncertainly. And of course, this begins, and even our Constitution that we exalt is a tremendous violation of one person, one vote. The voters, there are 2 senators who are going to vote on the nomination of the next Supreme Court justice from the state of California, which has 50 million people. And there are 2 senators from a couple of states that have under 600,000 people that are going to get the same vote. And, this issue of gerrymandering, which I'm sure we'll be talking about, or trying to deny people, voting has always been a tool and control of voters for people who have power or are in office to keep that power. And it's been used by both. It's been used by both parties. It's particularly, in my view, been used by the right and used particularly to restrict African Americans. But, I'm not so sure that there's a lot of historians who will say the election of John Kennedy over Richard Nixon in Illinois in 1960 was an example of, the Democratic Party engaging in affecting voting trends. As I say, I think I don't think it's equal. I don't think both parties are equally to blame, but I think there is some blame on both sides. The university's efforts around this are fundamentally about trying to make this as easy as possible for students to vote and to try to encourage you, despite the nuttiness and difficulty of the rules, to make it easier for you to vote. So we've told those of you who want to vote in Missouri many times that you have one more day to register on the state's website. Now, you all have access to the internet. Everybody on this call has access to the internet, or they wouldn't be on this call, so etc. So you can do it that way. We've provided virtually every day from October 12th to 26th the ability to get notarized. You have to be notarized to do mail-in ballots in Missouri under most circumstances. I'm getting notarized tomorrow morning. My ballot is sitting on the kitchen table, as is my spouse. We have a friend who's a notary who will stop by and notarize them. We have polling places on campus this year. So we've made it easy for you to have this on campus. And one of the things that Missouri does allow is it allows students to use Washington University issued IDs. In some other states like New Hampshire, there are actually challenges to university IDs and they may not be acceptable in this. So we're doing what we can to make it easier for you to vote. But I think this brings to mind the question you asked. What's my question? So the evidence in America is that voting is incredibly important. Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump by under 100,000 votes in 3 states. George Bush defeated Al Gore, an election that had huge ramifications for environmental policy, by 537 votes in Florida. It's a whole question about a legal procedure, but that was the official. It was 537 votes in Florida. So why don't 99% of the people vote, or 95% of the votes? It's clearly voting matters enormously in America. Many of our students, many members of our community, the politics of our community tend to be toward the more liberal side. People are engaged in protests, etc. Those protests are going to have a hugely different audience depending on the results of the presidential election. So my question is, why aren't 95% of the people voting?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would stand in line all day if I had to vote in this election. I mean, I have something I gotta say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's actually a lot of ideas going through the chat as well, sort of touching on Jennifer, your question of why youth turnout might be consistently low, that shows some overlap perhaps with the vice chancellors as well. I'd love to switch into additional questions, sort of talking about ways to combat this issue, right? It's something, as vice chancellors talked about, has been in place, or there's evidence and instances of since voting was a right in America, for various populations at various times. I'd love to sort of hear from Justin and Jennifer first, perhaps, about the role of grassroots movements and initiatives in St. Louis that have been particularly effective in combating voter suppression over the years, and what might be still missing from those efforts. Perhaps we can start with Jennifer. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I mean, I think one of the main things missing from this effort is funding, if I'm being really honest, because everything that you want to do to reach voters costs money, whether it's making copies of flyers or, putting ads on the radio. So that is an issue that has to be addressed. But more to the point, the grassroots can do a great deal. And this year was a good example of that, when the notary requirement, which by the way has always existed in Missouri, it's just never been that much of an issue outside of college students voting, because for the average person, people just didn't use ballots by mail at all, so that was something nobody really thought about. And then suddenly, when it became clear that that might be a large scale need, people really did mobilize very well and set up a bunch of notary hotlines, notary hubs. A lot of groups got together, people became notaries for the first time. So that was a good example of the way that a grassroots movement can really take hold and do some major things. Another thing that happened, my organization worked with the League of Women Voters to go into the County Board of Elections during the August primary. And we got them to allow us to be deputized as poll workers and call people whose ballots had been rejected for deficiencies. So we went in there and we called folks who had made a mistake on their ballot envelope, but let them know that it was going to be rejected, and gave them, 3 options for fixing it. Unfortunately, not everybody could come in and fix their ballots, because many times they were, say, in a senior living facility and they couldn't leave because of COVID, or they just had no transportation. So that was really sad, and honestly, it was super upsetting. But the upside was that the county election board took the feedback from our effort and redesigned the ballot envelope to make it less confusing for voters. So now the envelope they're getting in November, it has much clearer instructions, and there's not this little box that if you miss checking it, your vote doesn't get counted. So those are great grassroots efforts that have paid some dividends. And I'd love to see more efforts like that. We really need to have some efforts to combat disinformation, because that is honestly killing democracy. That is a lot more complicated, though, than I can really kind of imagine the scope of what it would take to do that, because the people who are doing that have access to all the tools in the arsenal, and we're kind of acting as, again, grassroots groups.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Can you restate your question, please?
Absolutely. Yeah. So in particular, we're hoping to sort of orient campus and student engagement towards grassroots initiatives in the larger St. Louis community. So our question is about the effectiveness of grassroots level initiatives towards voter suppression, and what might be missing from previous efforts that we can get involved in or need in particular for this election.
That's a lot to come back in a short answer.
Take your time.
Outside of Jennifer and her great coalition, I would say We Power, Deaconess Foundations, and how they're able to connect with various different grassroots organizations that are led by some very smart and intelligent Black women or women of color, to help go out and connect with our neighbors that they have relationships with. And that talks to one of the biggest things. How do we build relationships? If grassroots organizations and community organizations are going to help make a change in any election, they're going to have to go build relationships with those they do not want to have a conversation with outside of a controlled space. You know, just because a lot of these people that look like us and stay in the same neighborhoods as us, they're afraid of us, because a lot of people are moving into these neighborhoods looking for great returns on what they bought. But in doing that, they're not connecting outside of the people that live in the same quality of life as them, if that makes sense. And when we talk about voting suppression and how it takes us all, we're going to have to go reach our residents that they call the disparities that show up in the data. And that is one of the things that made all of the great African-American and white leaders from the past so great. They went in a lot of places that other people wouldn't go. They wouldn't go talk to those people. And when they came and talked to those residents or potential voters, they talked to them about things that they can connect with. Like right now, we got police shooting a lot of people. And on this upcoming budget, we have judges. So one of the things I did was, I think Jennifer put this up, a ballot of all the people, all the judges. So I put a post up on Facebook saying, if any of these judges did anything that you did not like, or have locked up from your family members or friend, and you didn't think that was what they were supposed to get, share this and tell everybody to vote no. I got a lot of inboxes on that post about, yeah, we need to get this judge out of here. And some of these people have not voted. Some of them have not voted ever in their life, but some of them have not voted since President Obama ran last. And how do we get those who historically don't vote to come and vote and be a part of that change? Because there's a big myth going on that if you've committed a felony that you can't vote. So that has been running rampant. People like Jennifer, our Senator Carla May, and many others have been having to go really get in the trenches and talk to people about, no, that's not true. They had to tell them the whole process. I've seen some of our elected officials and grassroots leaders talk to people for almost an hour to get them to help them to understand the misinformation that is going out. So one of the things as a grassroots entity or organization that you have to do is, once again, build that trust and relationships with everyone so they can believe in what you're talking about and that you're not going to lead them astray. And that's something else that plagues our communities when it comes to voting, trust.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have a lot of people that look good, wear cheap suits off the rack, and they want to tell good stories about the good old days. But that's only good to the elders, that's 65 and older. The young people, they don't want to care. They don't care about the Harlem Tap Room and what Martin Luther King used to look like. They want to figure out how you're going to change their lives so they won't have to do what they call trapping. Trapping is a word to categorize their lifestyle. They even have a political party. They're called the Trap Publicans, and they believe in you can't come in their neighborhoods without cutting them in. And if you're going to do any disharm to the elders in the neighborhoods, you have to go by any means necessary. Those are their two standards. But how do we get those type of people who have that type of influence in their neighborhoods over the people, young and old, that don't participate in this, and to get them to go vote? Because it's a lot that's missing, and I'm going to shut up because I feel like I've been talking too long.
No, absolutely. And it's such a great segue. I think one of the reasons why this club or organization, ImpactSTL, was started was to really break through that WashU bubble that so often forms around our campus. And I think having more awareness about how divided and regional St. Louis is in terms of just even difference in access to various resources within miles of different neighborhoods. Either, Justin, expanding off of that, or Vice Chancellor, I would love to hear sort of how maybe interconnection between neighborhoods in St. Louis can be improved to ensure that not only resources, but also information, as Justin was talking about, is equitably distributed to ensure those who maybe have not felt, participating in voting has been accessible to them previously.
So I don't fully know. I mean, I'll say a few things, but part of this is a very deep information gap. And it's a very deep information gap because it's all very complicated. I mean, most people don't understand, for example, that voting policies, and Jennifer started this by saying Missouri is a very hard place to vote compared to other states. Most people don't understand that voting is controlled by states predominantly. It's more complicated than that, and particularly, I mean, there were clearly federal controls on the Voting Rights Act, which the current Supreme Court took away. But we have something that almost nobody understands, which is Proposition 3, which is an attempt to basically take a over 60% public approval of which eliminated gerrymandering and would have fundamentally restructured the state Senate and the state rep. And now the legislature has decided not to do that. And they're basically have put together something that's very hard to understand. That makes it seem like if you vote yes for Proposition 3, you're voting for reform. And in fact, it's the complete and absolute opposite. I can see Justin and Jennifer both nodding as I say this. So the problem is, this is really complicated. I mean, I happen to be very involved in Proposition 3 in a number of ways, so I know it. But I'm not even sure I would know this if I was a normal citizen, if I wasn't involved in this. So the question is, how do we fairly communicate about this, especially in a world where, as opposed to the world that I grew up in as a child, where there were 3 TV stations, ABC, NBC, CBS, 4 actually, and PBS. And there was something called the Fairness Doctrine, which required that people be sort of middle of the road and presented things fairly, or you could go after the license of the station. Now, my mother-in-law, who's 99 years old, listens to Fox News all day, and she doesn't believe anything I believe, because that's her entire source of news. And that's the news that comes in. So we have the problem of, first, most of the news that people get is now by the internet, and people do not have equal access to the internet. And then we have the problem of people listening to things that have no truth value whatsoever. And people manipulate, and I don't know how to get out of this. I don't get how to get out of the sort of, you get to select your truth. I mean, we're at a university. And the message to all of you universities is fundamentally, you're entitled to your own opinions. But the fact that the world is round, you are actually not entitled to say the world's flat. There are rules about evidence, etc. And I'm deeply concerned about this, but I'm deeply concerned about the lack of information. And people have used the lack of information to serve their own interests. And I'm deeply concerned about how we break through this world. Mm-hmm. And I don't have a perfect answer because, I don't want to suppress freedom of the press, but man, I mean, and the other thing I'd say is, in this world, and this is a terrible issue of injustice, in order to get your message out, you need to spend a fortune. And often the interests that can spend a fortune are interests that represent very particular points of view.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the other half of our, not half, but the complement to our voter suppression is misinformation, particularly, what misinformation means. It means if it's, just limited, if it's obscured, if it's, twisted to serve an underlying motive and objective. And I'm curious for Jennifer or Justin, is that, whose responsibility would that be to combat that kind of misinformation, even separate from an election in particular? Is it, at a federal or governmental level to check that? Is it the responsibility of the individual? As Henry was saying, whose responsibility might it be, or who can directly help sort of combat prevalence of misinformation across different media?
Justin, did you want to answer that?
That's kind of tricky.
I mean, because yeah, I'm fine. If you want me to, I can too. That's up to you.
Only thing I have to say on that is we need smart advertising boxes all around the city, like the city of St. Louis has. We see those smart. I don't know what they're called, but I know you can ads, signage. Have you all seen them? They're like at major intersections. They have advertising. What does that look like in a community? On campus as well, that makes sure you're going to notice a smart screen talking about you need to know this. So like that's my only piece, and I'm gonna let Jennifer handle this.
So I consider misinformation and disinformation to be two completely different things. I mean, misinformation is something that's often driven by good intentions, but just mistake. It's a mistake that gets amplified and spread around. Disinformation is something much more insidious, where untruths are spread. I should say lies are spread deliberately in order to create a certain effect. And in today's world, the largest purveyors of disinformation, aside from the broadcast stations that took the abrogation of the fairness doctrine and ran with them to become propaganda outlets, but also social media is a real problem. And among those, I would say Facebook is the biggest problem. In fact, it's a gigantic problem, because here's the thing. Social media outlets are private companies. So, they aren't subject to any First Amendment concerns. They can regulate their platforms however they want. And in choosing not to stop hate speech, disinformation, harassment, and other types of things that damage a society, Facebook has played one of the biggest roles in the potential collapse of democracy in its they first of all, they allowed Cambridge Analytica to target people with disinformation and voter manipulation to convince them to stay home during the last election, or to create wedge issues that they amplified through the use of a complicated, network of bots, trolls, and legitimate accounts. And then you have the problems on their algorithms that boost certain content and that keep other content kind of, on the down low. Well, their algorithms tend to boost disinformation content. They have not only have they not done enough to combat that and change that, you almost wonder what their agenda really is, because they have been so resistant to making basic changes to their platform policies and to their algorithms that would, boost truth over disinformation. It's really troubling, and that's something that we could talk all day about. But I would say that social media in particular is probably where the rubber hits the road as far as disinformation goes.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And Justin, just curious to put you on the spot again. Sorry about it. I guess sort of following up on some of the trends discussed in the chat, to what extent is misinformation a partisan issue? And sort of what influence does the divided nature of our country play into misinformation, and how might we not sort of be able to combat it ahead of this particular election due to how divided we are?
I'm gonna give it to I'm gonna move this to something that we all like. It's called the TV. And I'm sorry. It's called the TV, and the role, like, we all like drama. We all like action. because we wanted to find things that takes our mind off of what's going on at work, what's going on in the office, what's going on in pettiness in our own family, right? So back to what Jennifer was talking about, those algorithms and anything that can be used against us, they do it. And this is why it's key for communities, business districts, universities to own their own data, because they're using that. Regardless if they're using those algorithms or they're looking at those, I can't think of the Nelson TV ratings people, like these people here watch this show, right? So if you're a person that's on whatever side of the table, you're going to go pay Nielsen for that information or whatever data bank to get this information, and you're going to flood it. You're going to flood it on TV, regardless if it's for a person that you're for or against. And once again, we like drama. Look at all the top TV shows. You know, Greg's Anatomy was a great show, I think. I hear a lot of people talking about it. I don't know. But you look at Power, Empire. I like capitalistic shows, so I like Billions. That's a whole nother world. But look how they use what they show us on during those times. And if you're on a channel, before Channel 11 got bought by Channel 2, it used to be a small independent network, and you can pay for advertising. I have an 83-year-old grandmother who's up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. I don't know what she's watching. But when she's over in her house in the morning, she comes, talks to me about different stuff, and she writes it on her notepad, like, what is this? Is this true? Because she doesn't listen to the president, but she does know one of his famous quotes, fake news. So she was like, is this real? And some of the other elders who are a part of our neighborhood garden, they come ask me the same thing. So it's very hard to stop this when you can't control who's doing advertising on TV, radio, or however. And that's where, once again, grassroots entities, universities come in and their expertise help inform their students or their residents, you know, with this. Who's much more trustworthy? Mr. Weber here, or some slick man you ain't seen on you ain't seen until he's running for election?
Well, that's very nice of you to say, but the slick guy would have a lot more hair. I can tell you that. Maybe let me just say, I think that Jennifer and Justin are raising. Look, I don't think you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There are limits to free speech, and there are limits, and I think, I'm not sure we've adjusted to Facebook having several billion people on Facebook globally. I'm not sure our system has yet adjusted. And of course, Facebook has not chosen to adjust themselves, right? They've chosen, in fact, because of exactly the reason Justin said, exactly because people like to have their views reinforced, because people like the more extreme stuff, etc. People like that. We haven't adjusted. We haven't adjusted to the danger that's created by people able to get misinformation to millions of people all the time. I don't think our system's adjusted for that. Now, obviously, the way to respond is an educated populace, but we haven't responded with that either. And you know, one of the things that over the long run, if we're in a world where people are going to be confronted with willful misinformation all the time, which I think they're going to be absent structural changes, we need to make a whole different, we need to make a whole different commitment to educating the public, starting with kids in school, so that they know they're going to be subjected to things that are absolutely not true every day. I don't think we've ever constructed our educational system to respond to that, to say, you know, people are going to tell you things that are the equivalent of the world being flat. And you have to be able to respond to that. And I think that's just a huge, I think places like Washington University do it, but that's not, you can't depend on higher education. This has to start in first grade. This has to start in the public schools, etc. That people understand that in order to be engaged citizens in the world that we live in, you have to be much more skeptical. You have to be much engaged. You have to work harder because people are going to tell you things that are crazy all the time.
Absolutely. And I think to build off a question that was just submitted by the audience, what can we at the individual level do to sort of identify or weed out lies, disinformation when doing our own research or finding our own information? How can we identify these like credible sources?
Well,
go ahead.
No, go ahead, Justin.
Go ahead.
Well, one thing some of us have is the internet, and I'll give this to Facebook's credit when they do some type of research on some news articles that people report as fake news. But what happened if you see a news article on your timeline or email inbox? How do you go be the fact finder, or how do you and your friends be the fact finders and put this information up, not just on social media, but like in our neighborhood and many others in the city of St. Louis, they have Nextdoor. How can you use Nextdoor as a platform to disseminate the truths, the truths from the fake news? That would be my suggestion. Or go to your neighborhood organizations or ward meetings and get on their agendas and ask to be a part of, if they're having a discussion about the elections and things that's on the ballot, and you be able to, say, this is what the Post put out, this is what was on Facebook, but this is the actual policy right here. I've highlighted some key things and distribute out copies to people. Because as Henry here talked about, it was that this is something that people need to learn at an early age. But since we don't have that liberty, how do we teach people right when they're there? Because we all have very short attention span here in St. Louis. I can't speak to everywhere else. So while you have people in that space, you have to take advantage of that and give them the information they need with the facts. And one thing I learned from the Brown School, let's get that data. Let's get that data and bring it back. So.
Yeah, I agree, Justin. I can think of like 3 things that really need to happen. Some of them are huge and some of them are things that we can do immediately. I mean, the first thing is almost a cultural thing, and that is that we need to get away from letting people lie with impunity, to get away from treating lies with kid gloves by calling them untruths or twisted the facts or something like, just call it a lie because it's a lie. And be hard on people who lie. There should be consequences, societal consequences. There should be, disapproval. There should be a consequence for lying. And not only should there be a consequence for lying, there should be a consequence for engaging in false equivalence, which is another huge thing that is absolutely tearing this country apart. And it's part of like the news. Sometimes when they try too hard to be fair, like say there's, when they try to say there's 2 sides to every story, like there's 2 sides to climate change, is it real? Is it not? No, there really aren't 2 sides to that issue. And we need to stop creating the false paradigm that there are 2 sides, because that elevates the lie to, a co-equal basis with the truth. And that leads us to kind of a post-truth society. And that's not someplace we want to be. The second thing is, kids do need to start learning about critical thinking skills very early on. By the time you're in college, it's too late. I remember when I was really young in the 70s in Iowa in public school, and this must have been first grade, we had an entire unit on propaganda, and I still remember it. They told us all about the ways that we would be manipulated by propaganda and advertising. And it was super interesting. They had great examples, and they did that when, I was 6, 7 years old. So, that was a great time to do it, because then you grow up with that skepticism and understanding how these different tactics are working. But then from a very, right now perspective, one of the programs that my organization is helping with is election protection in Missouri. And among the things that we're doing is a social media monitoring program. that deals with two things: voter assistance, but also identifying and reporting and or dealing with misinformation and disinformation. It's going to be super important. We're training people. We definitely need younger volunteers to get on other platforms that most of us wouldn't necessarily get on, like TikTok. And you can, report it, you can handle it. There's a lot of great things that we can do with that program, and I'd really like to see a lot of participation in it. The one thing I would just say generally, though, if you're going to, in your own personal life, engage in fact checking or debunking, don't ever repeat the disinformation in order to debunk it. I see so many people putting up these myth versus fact things. Don't do that, because you're repeating the lie. And when people see that, the first thing they see is the lie. And that sticks in their head, whether you're telling them it's not true or not. So that's just, if you take one thing away from it, don't ever repeat the disinformation in order to tell the truth. Just tell the truth affirmatively.
I mean,
Absolutely.
we have to collectively reach a decision that alternative facts is not acceptable. It is perfectly valid to have a deep political debate about how to address climate change, what the alternatives are, what the pros and cons. And you can even take the position that climate change is unchangeable, or it's not as bad as people say it is. All of those are valid positions. The idea that climate change is not occurring is not a fact. It's just not a fact. And I think Jennifer makes a really important point. The mainstream media has been willing to say that isn't quite right, that isn't, etc. I think we need to basically say lies are lies, and lies are disqualifying for people in public right, or at least the second lie is, maybe you get it wrong once, okay. But a pattern of lying is disqualifying for anyone. And I think that until we do that, we're in real trouble. And I think that, it's not okay. Facts are facts. Climate change is a fact.
Absolutely. And I was going to specify the question a little bit further for you. I know the Gephardt Institute at WashU is particularly involved in voter engagement. What sort of initiatives have they put out specifically to combat now that we're calling them lies officially, the lies that are disseminated either more nationally or even just on our campus?
Well, I think Gephardt has really, in some ways, tried to focus on what are the issues at play in this election, how important it is to vote, and how much it really means, and how to do that. I think it's basically, Gephardt has viewed that the training that we actually provide to you as students at WashU gives you the complete ability to make those decisions for yourself. We don't view you as vulnerable voters. I mean, Justin talked a lot about vulnerable voters in many ways. So I think that Gephardt's, very significant efforts to encourage voting, to encourage involvement, to understand what the issues are of the election, to encourage sort of understanding that this is existential for certain things, including climate change, this election, has been focused more on that direction. And I think that Laura in the note really raises what I might wanted to have asked as my question if I'd done before, is how do we make lies unacceptable again? How do we make it unacceptable for leaders of any political persuasion to regularly lie on important issues of any political persuasion? But I think there's just been one other comment. I think Justin and Jennifer made a point really early. Lying has worked for people. The reason lying has worked for people. You know, lying on Facebook can get you a lot more hits. I mean, things that people like I write that are careful and numbers based, you know, we get hundreds of hits, which in Facebook means nobody's read it, right? As opposed to if you say that Justin's a mass murderer in North St. Louis neighborhood, etc., you know, there you'll get, 100,000 hits, even if unless there's a social cost to saying things.
But the social cost, I think, not existing, plus the fact that lying is a way to retain power now because there is no social cost, there's no political cost.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really why lies have flourished currently. No one is willing to call out the liar because the liar gives them access to power. And that's a really, really dangerous place to be in right now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's where transparent and accountability needs to come in at. And you look at I don't know so much here in the United States, but in a lot of foreign countries abroad, they have where everything's online, from court proceedings to committee hearings. So you're with COVID, we now are able to see what our elected officials are from the city of St. Louis. I can say I don't know much about St. Louis County, but you can go on YouTube or Zoom and watch them live. But that doesn't show you what happens behind the scenes. And one of the great things it took me, I think it was 39 years to learn from. Hank, you may enjoy this. I've been coming to Washington University since I was 12 years old by myself, and I never knew what the words on that crest meant until I heard Michael Bloomberg say it at his commencement speech, seek the truth. And that's what we the people need to do, and hold those people accountable. And when we go to our elected officials and we show them the evidence or some things of that nature, and they don't want to do anything because some of these people are hidden on their MCE reports, and we can't see that $10,000 or $2,500 check wrote to them, how do we get that and present those facts to the people to get these people out? And if we need to, how can we call the Secretary of State to get some type of repeal or special election? Because what's being done to the greater community is a detriment. And even more so, it's even more detriment to those people who have been living there since like the 1950s or 60s, who are unable to participate and who are going off of, Bill Clay, boy, he was good, just like his daddy. We're gonna vote for him, right? And not just using Lacey, but all the other elected officials who keep their hands in cookie jars. Not saying Congressman Clay does that, but we do have a lot. And you see on the news now, they say one does this, one does that. I want to go look for the facts myself and share it with my neighbors. Because I don't like people sitting here telling us, oh, you should do this, you should do that. And in a whole nother room, you got a kickback, or you're going to get a kickback off some of the interest of the monies that are going to come from this. And we have to, because it's doing everyone a disservice. When you have foundations giving money to neighborhood organizations around this to stop this and to help inform and educate their neighbors and residents, but you have elected officials who are downtown helping the same people elect them get citations. And those people don't know they're doing that. I'm just be quiet. Sorry.
No, but Justin, you raised a really good point about, how accountability, the lack of accountability kind of leads to these lies.
Mm-hmm.
and gerrymander. So we can bring this all the way back to Amendment 3 and how Amendment 3 is so dangerous, because it would absolutely not only remove the representation for children, non-citizens, and anyone potentially who's ineligible to vote by enacting a citizen voting age population, metric for apportioning districts, but it will allow political gerrymandering, which the Supreme Court has said is completely fine. It will allow political gerrymandering, which then further entrenches the extremes of every political philosophy and makes people completely unaccountable to their constituents in any way, because they're set. They don't have to tell you the truth. They don't have to be accountable to you. They can have as extreme, they're going to play toward their extreme base that keeps them in office. So, one of the ways that we can hold people accountable is through elections. But if we have gerrymandered districts, we can't do that. So that's one of the other many reasons that Amendment 3 is very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, gerrymandering, the price of gerrymandering is that you end up without competitive seats. So you end up with folks not necessarily having to be transparent. They push toward the ends. But I want to say, some of this is about us as Americans. So it's not a perfect test of what people are doing, but it tells you something, and that's why every tax returns tell you something. They tell you a fair amount. And every president of both parties for a very long time has released their tax returns. Sometimes, and why is it we have a candidate who hasn't done that? And my view is, I guess my sense is we need to say that's not okay, that's disqualifying. That it is disqualifying if you want to run for president of the United States or probably governor, not to release your tax returns. And sure, it's going to say what you gave money, what charities you gave money to. It's going to figure out whether you're getting consulting fees. Now, people lie on their taxes, but there's a legal remedy for that, etc. But it's one of the ways that we get disclosure is people's taxes. We learned that Joe Biden made a lot of money writing a book. Okay, right? Okay, we know that. You can decide whether that's important or not. But it's very hard without people's tax returns to know what they're doing financially. It's not perfect, but boy, it's a heck of a lot better than not having it. And that's why this is what I'm worried about in America. We had a social norm. George Bush released his tax return. Barack Obama released his tax return. Ronald Reagan released his tax return. Bill Clinton and then Hillary Clinton released their tax returns. That was a social norm that said, you run for president, you release your tax return, and every newspaper in the country and everybody who has an accountant can look at your tax return and see if you're cheating, see if this makes sense, etc. I can tell you that most of those tax returns were non-events. Most people, especially I think if they know they're running for president, have very clean tax returns. But according to what the New York Times is telling us, that the Trump tax return has a lot of news in it. But we've allowed somebody to run for president. This was 4 years ago. And I don't get it. I'm worried about America. I'm worried about the fact, I'm from a party, but I'm willing to put basically my hand on the Bible that I won't vote for president for a candidate who doesn't release their tax return of either party.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There's so many layers to this issue that we've scratched the surface. I think that in that sentiment, Vice Chancellor, where we really want our community to sort of know where to go from here and how to get involved. And so I would love for each of the panelists to sort of speak to the ways in which they'd encourage the students watching to get involved, to mitigate instances of voter suppression and misinformation. And if I can add just a personal undertone to this question, I think the idea of the normalization of radicalization is something that we need to discuss in why we can't limit ourselves to these social norms that we've allowed to manifest. So in underlying those answers, would anyone feel comfortable starting off and sort of guiding us through? I know there've been a lot of input in the chat, signing up to be a notary, poll drives, transportation services? What are some of the ways that we as students can sort of get involved to mitigate these instances of suppression and disinformation?
You got one head of a double-headed monster on here right now. You have Jennifer and her great coalition, and you also have I can't think of her last name. Jennifer, Gina.
Gina McClendon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, actually, we're all together. Gina is, we're tight. We're working on the same stuff.
Right. So those would be my first two. These great women, those would be the first two, because they're going to tell you the truth. They're going to give you all the key facts that you need to know, not that what they want you to know. Mm-hmm. They're going to teach you that, and they're going to help you understand for you to go out and mobilize, whether it's on campus, whether it's in the Loop, Central West End, or wherever your hometown is, or whatever social media platforms you choose to use. They are a great, once again, We Power, Deaconess Foundation, Forward Through Ferguson, and to Hank was talking about climate, our local United Nations Association. I don't know if you all know we have one, but we do have one. I'm the chair of our Sustainable Development Goals. But yeah, I think those are some great institutions or entities to help start you off on the right path. And you all have a great School of Sustainable Design, I think it is. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think it's School of Sustainable Design. I'm not really sure, but that's it, Hank. Okay.
So I think that I think these are really good suggestions. I think the voter access and engagement group at the Brown School, which Gina runs, is doing a whole bunch of prep work and a whole bunch of work today. Getting in touch with Jennifer and her group about how you can help before that in the day are extremely helpful. WashU Votes is extremely helpful. So I think that, I think that one of the things that is so I think that if you have some time, volunteering on these things can matter a whole lot between now and then. But can I take this in just a little bit different direction?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because I'm worried about something we haven't talked about. I'm worried about the effort to say that these elections are rigged and that mail ballots are rigged. I'm really worried about the attacks on the integrity of the American voting system. And it's not perfect. It's not perfect basically in ways that it keeps poor people and keeps felons, et cetera, for not voting. But the idea that for example, mail voting is subject to large scale manipulation is not true. 5 states do all mail voting. 5 states, I don't think 5 states, everybody votes by mail. Places around the world. And I'm really concerned. I mean, in thinking about this panel, I'm also concerned about the attempts to contest the election. And so I think we've got to do everything we can to make this as fair as possible, but we also have to resist the rhetorical argument. And this argument is not fact-based. Nobody believes that stealing votes is a large problem in America. People not voting is a large problem. People being discouraged to vote is a large problem. But the fact that my vote that's sitting downstairs by mail is going to be stolen in some sense is not a large problem. And I'm really worried about this.
I think that is a really super legitimate thing to be concerned about. I mean, we remember that this administration put together an entire what I call the voter suppression panel to talk about, the alleged problems in this country with our voting system, and they really couldn't come up with anything. There's actually a database on the White House website of so-called instances of voter fraud, and it's like a lot of nothing. You can sometimes see instances where politicians, pull fast things, but voters just don't. I mean, because as you said, the problem is more that people don't vote rather than they try to, pull a fast one. And I want to explain something about mail-in voting that is really important, because people need to know, first of all, it's not that easy to cast a mail-in ballot after the things I talked about, having to get all your statement right and all this kind of stuff, the application process, the return process. So there are some barriers to mail voting, but the safety of mail voting in terms of integrity is pretty unimpeachable. If you think about your voter file as a parking lot and it has one space for every election, as soon as you park a ballot there, no other ballot can be accepted, under your name. So it's not like people are going to be, printing ballots here and there. And I mean, that just can't happen. It's just absolute fantasy. And I apologize for actually even repeating one of the lies that was told there to give an example, but almost everything that's being said in opposition to mail voting is complete fantasy. That said, I would recommend that every voter sort of take some initiative on their own part to follow up with your ballot to make sure it arrives on time, to know what your options are if it doesn't, and educate others about the same thing. Because I think there are some concerns there about the post office and other ways that create this chaos and distrust around the election. It's hard to tell what's real and what's not, but I think it's fair to say that what is real is that you should take initiative to track your ballot and make sure that it is submitted and counted. In terms of things that people can do to help right now, please sign up for election protection. You can do the social media monitoring. You can help us monitor poll sites on election day. And when I say monitor poll sites, I don't mean go inside, because that's a whole specifically separate thing that you have to do through political parties. But this is just like standing outside polling places and seeing if people need help and holding up a sign telling them to call the 866 Our Vote hotline. So it's, something super simple, but really, really important to have that presence there.
Mm-hmm.
Social media monitoring, very important, because you can have more of an impact than if you think about your social circle and their social circle that just goes on and on. If you can get out some proactive messages and stop some damaging messages from being propagated, then you've done a whole bunch, and it's not hard. And then finally, if you guys are looking for something that you can do in your own neighborhoods, I have tons of flyers about, making a voting plan. What are your options for voting in Missouri this year? How do you make a plan, stick to it, execute it, and where do you go if you have problems? Come to my house and pick up a stack of flyers and stick them in your, in your neighbor's doors. I mean, that alone, I think, has a much more far-reaching impact than you might realize.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And vote early if
Yes.
you're voting by mail.
Mm-hmm.
If you're voting by mail, vote early. There's no cost in voting early. There potentially are costs in voting late.
So, and that's true. Yeah. If you're out of state, yes, definitely make sure that you do that early, because you don't want, if your state has a postmarked by deadline, you really don't want your ballots trickling in days after the election and delaying results if we can help it. But please remember that in Missouri, we have a received by deadline. If your ballot is not at the election authority office by 7 o'clock on election night, it doesn't get counted no matter why it wasn't there. If the mail got delayed, if some dog ate it, a meteor hit, whatever the reason, if it's not there, it doesn't get counted. But you still have options if your ballot gets delayed in the mail. So that's what I'm saying. It's really important to kind of know the whole picture, know what your options are if something goes wrong, and help other people know what their options are if something goes wrong.
Absolutely. And I believe
it is. Somebody says it's 2020 and meteors are a thing. Yes, they actually are. There is a meteor making a very close pass toward Earth on, I think, November 2nd, because a senator, yeah, I'm not kidding. It's I think it's even an asteroid, actually. And I saw Chuck Schumer posting about it several weeks ago, saying people vote early, and he was posting a story about how this asteroid is going to pass really close to Earth on November 2nd. So, I mean, honestly, anything's possible this year. So
Makes sense for 2020 for
why
sure.
not?
Yeah, thank you. And I believe you did post that link for signing up, correct?
Yeah, it is protectthevote.net.
And we'll be sure to list all these great action items out on our social media as well. In our last 10 minutes or so, honestly, the engagement in the chat has been so incredible to read through, and I'd love to circle back to the original questions that our panelists posed, as there were a lot of great ideas in the chat, starting with Justin's about what a 21st century voting platform looks like. I think some commonalities we see are obviously a center towards the use of social media, technology, an app even was suggested, which is, a great idea to potentially have all that information in one place to refer to, even to find like polling stations or where to get notarized, etc. Something that was also brought up in regards to that question, Justin, was engaging more with more progressive issues, or contemporary issues is more of the right word, discussing how perhaps people with mental health issues or persons with disabilities, etc., face additional instances of voter suppression, and how in understanding those issues in more of a contemporary progressive lens, how do we target our platforms towards those issues as well?
Okay, you're going to make me have to wear a different hat I haven't had to wear in some years. Prior to me getting into this racial equity work, I was a mental health consultant. And just thinking from that, how a lot of organizations had to fight, depending on where you're at in the United States, they got polling places inside of their adult programming centers. I don't think that happens a lot here. Not from what I've seen. I haven't been in that space for a while. But how can we do that though? How can we put like places for people, and the Independent Center, which is a psychosocial rehabilitation for adults with mental illnesses? How can we equip those type of places, paraquad, from a accessibility, from mobility disabilities that they are dealing with? How can we get polling places there for those people that attend those places? Because one of the things with mental health is, and one dealing with like schizophrenia, or those, I think it's called schizoaffective, where you have both of them. You have bipolar and you have schizophrenia. They're afraid to go outside. So they're going to need like a caseworker or a great neighbor or someone that they can trust to go with them to the polling places that could also possibly close them down, could help me calm them down. Once they go to their polling place and you see a line outside. Some people have social anxieties and things of that nature. But how do we make that more accessible to them? Just taking it to them in the places that they trust and are safe, or even adding our public libraries. How can we use those more for polling places? In my neighborhood, we have like 4. We have like 4 polling places, and the library is not one. You can register to vote at the library, but you can't go vote in the library. And if that's a much more safer place than a church, matter of fact, I think all our polling places are at churches. So, or one's at a school, but nevertheless, how do we make them more comfortable and accessible for everyone like you all are talking about? And we have to go to places where they're at. Because outside of that, like I have a uncle, he lives in a state facility. He doesn't have a mental health issue, but he has, I can't remember exactly what it is, but he's under state custody. He's not a threat to anyone or anything, but he's never voted. He can talk, but they don't allow him to vote for whatever reason. Maybe it's some type of state law. I don't know if my grandparents set that up. But for those that stay in state facilities, how can they participate in this as well if you're not there by courts, if that makes sense? So those are just my suggestions.
Absolutely, yes. I really encourage everyone to keep scrolling through the chat for all of these ideas that are So great. And for Jennifer's question that I think, parts tie into the Vice Chancellor's as well, is sort of how do we maximize youth voter turnout and just general engagement and participation for the population. I think a lot of people were under the similar consensus of the barriers we talked about access and, informational distribution. But something that came up that we didn't talk about was the motivation to make your voice heard doesn't seem, in some cases, as people have pointed out, entirely impactful for just the sentiment like what will my vote actually do, or even of sentiments not feeling like they need to participate for a certain outcome in their state to change. How do you address issues of galvanization and even just motivation to participate and go to your polling place on election day?
If your vote weren't important, there wouldn't be so many powerful people trying to keep you from voting. I mean, that's really the bottom line.
Mhm.
That is how you can gauge the importance of your vote, is how hard people are working to keep you from voting. So people are working overtime to do that, and you really have to go ahead and cast your ballot. Right now, it does involve some extra effort because of the way things are set up, but there are also ways to change that going forward, and your vote can help change that. For example, because of different funding opportunities and the will of the commission to do it, St. Louis County was able to get custom print on demand balloting systems, which means you in St. Louis County now, you can go to any polling place you want on election day. You don't have to go to an assigned polling place anymore. You can go anywhere, because when they check you in, they print the exact ballot for where you live, no matter where you're getting it done. And I thought of that because of what Justin was saying about having voting sites at places like Paraquad. Well, that kind of balloting technology would make that possible. Right now, it's not possible in places with different technology or more antiquated technology that requires precinct by precinct programming for voting machines. But in St. Louis County now, you could literally have a voting site anywhere that you could staff it, and people can go, wherever is most convenient for them. And I think that's a fantastic step forward. The next step forward is to implement things that make registration and voting less complicated, because I think people get easily frustrated with that. And so it's a lot easier to tell yourself that, oh, my vote doesn't matter because it's such a hassle to do it. And there should be a ballot initiative coming up in the next year or so in Missouri to make voting a lot easier, to do more of the automatic registration kind of thing, to do early voting, just to sort of make the process more in line with modern states where they have a more open voting process. But ultimately, there is that psychological barrier to voting, and I think part of it comes from even younger people feeling disenchanted and having some cynicism about the process, maybe saying, oh, well, they're all liars, so why should I bother? Or my vote doesn't really matter because of the Electoral College, why should I bother? I mean, all of those thoughts are really, in part put there by people who want you to feel that way and want you to not vote. If people have always been, this entire, the whole nation can be measured by the struggle to take power away from the original, white male property owners who have held on to power as hard as they can for centuries. And every step of progress is, pulling that power away. And that's always through the mechanism of voting. I mean, that's, the entire struggle of, race, class, gender in this country is based on who holds the political power and who holds the vote. And if youth are feeling unrepresented or feeling like their voices aren't being heard, that's partly because, they're not the ones who are voting. And so if you don't have to worry about a demographic's vote, you're not going to worry too much about the issues that affect them. So if you want to achieve something that will reflect the aims and the concerns of your generation, you just got to get out there and vote. I mean, there's really no choice.
537 votes in Florida had a huge effect on the world climate change issue. It was at the top of Al Gore's list of priorities was climate change. 537 people. There probably are 537 WashU students who, unless somebody pushes them, won't vote because it's inconvenient, it's a Tuesday, they have class, etc., etc. First, it's essential. It's essential to have impact because one of the reasons the elderly, for example, get so much attention is they vote. People look at turnout, as Jennifer mentioned. But you don't know. Maybe it will turn out that it will be a landslide one way or another, and you'll feel that your vote didn't matter. But 537 votes decided a presidential election. There are 330 million Americans. The last election was decided by 100. And don't believe the polls. Don't believe them for a second. Exercise your franchise. And if nothing else, recognize that people have died for the right to vote in America. People have died for the right to engage in the franchise and frankly, have their voices count as much as mine as a white male landowner, property owner, etc. It's a mark of tremendous disservice to those that came before us, not to take advantage of the rights that they fought so hard to get.
Absolutely. And vote early, because we say the election's not in 28 days, it's over in 28 days. So I think
that's absolutely right.
So you can vote either if you're using a mail ballot, an absentee by mail, or a no excuse mail-in ballot. Fill it out now and get it notarized if you need to, send it back. But if you are registered to vote locally, you can vote absentee in person at your local election board or one of the satellite locations that are opening later in October. In the city, that's October 12th. In the county, that's October 22nd. I voted on September 23rd. So, bring on the asteroid. I've already voted. So, yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you all. I want to say a huge, tremendous thank you to our three panelists who took the time.
It was great fun. Thank you. This was
thanks for having us.
Yes,
thanks
great.
for having us.
I encourage everyone to also, sign up for our email list and our social media, where we'll have all these action items laid out, and we'll be organizing different initiatives within our community to get people to the polls, get their ballots in on time, and really take to heart everything that we learned today. So thank you all so much again for joining, and please check out all the follow-up information to come. Thank you, Justin, Vice Chancellor Weber, and Jennifer. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.